Hey everyone, this is Mick here from Brutalitopia, along with Durf as well.
Hello, everyone.
We are here in Chicago at Park West right now with Steven Wilson. He is going to be playing later tonight. Steven, thank you so much for doing this interview with us. Why don't you tell us how the tour overall has been going so far for you guys?
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, we've been playing obviously a lot of new material from the new record, and the record itself has been very well received. So we're finding that people are, already very familiar with that material, which always makes it a little bit easier. And yeah, fantastic. We've seen a big kind of increase in the sort of numbers of people coming to the shows. It definitely seems to have some really good momentum, which is gratifying.
You guys have played some of the newer material overseas beforehand, before this tour, correct?
Well, we played it at home. Yeah, we played it in Europe. We did a whole tour of Europe before we came here. Yeah.
It's always kind of a standard question. I notice we ask a lot. Do you notice any visible differences in how people receive your music, versus at home or in the U.S. or wherever?
I notice significant differences from city to city. It's not a country thing. I mean, there are places where you can go in the world where you'll South America, for example, but I find generally between North America and Europe, it's not to do with the country, it's to do with the city. For example, you can play in New York and Philadelphia, which are only 2 hours apart, and the audience reaction will be completely different. New York is very reserved, very quiet, and Philadelphia they go crazy. So I think that that trying to look for country sort of distinctions is a little bit harder, but definitely city to city, yeah.
Speaking of the new album itself, I know you've said it's been getting pretty good reviews overall. Just kind of your take on the album itself. What was unique and different about this album compared to perhaps any of your solo stuff or any of your other stuff you've done in total?
I think the big change on this record for me was the decision to make it with my band, and as opposed to make it in the way I'd made my 2 previous records, which were very much solo records in the true sense of the word, in the sense that I wrote the material without having any idea who would be playing on the songs. And then I kind of figured out, well, it would be nice to have a sax player there or a drummer there. And this time around, I knew exactly who I was writing for right from the beginning. And when and obviously I'm used to that situation because I have bands that I write for too, or I have written for. And that's a very different thing when you know the musical personalities and you know what they are capable of, and you know the certain things that they do that are particularly good that you want to incorporate into the music. So that was a big thing for me to write for this band, and also to then extend that kind of philosophy into the actual way we recorded, which was live in the studio. And that's not a very common way to make a record these days. Most people do the thing where they bring the drummer in for a week and they work on the drums and they send the drummer away, they bring the guitar player in, and you kind of work in that very modular, controlled way. But actually, to record as a live unit in the studio, there's this chemistry and electricity that you can never get with any other way. And so my decision to do it this time was quite significant for me personally, because I've never done that before. And it was a bit scary, but these guys are so good that I felt kind of fairly confident and comfortable, sort of risking to that process. And so the record was made in a very short, we made it pretty much in a week in Los Angeles in September. And I'd say 85% of the record went down during those 7 days, which is extraordinary for me. Yeah.
Do you feel, approaching this record with a different process than you have from your previous work? Do you feel that has played into any of the reception at all? I mean, this is Steve Wilson's new record, of course, The Raven Who Refused to Sing. I mean, it's one of the only records I can remember not reading, not even a negative thing, but not even an ambivalent take. I mean, everything I've read about this record, the response has been overwhelmingly positive.
There are some negatives. I mean, as with everything, nothing ever gets kind of complete unanimity. But I would say, probably echoing slightly what you're saying, if I think back across my whole career, I can't remember a more overwhelmingly positive response to a record. Now, here's the thing. I've never released a record, at least certainly not for the last 10 years. I've never released a record that I didn't think was really good, because I wouldn't have released it if I didn't. That's not me being arrogant. It's just I wouldn't have said, okay, the record's finished, if I didn't believe it was good. So in a sense, every record I've made over the last 10 years or 15 years I've been incredibly proud of, and I've expected people to react to it incredibly well. And of course been disappointed when sometimes records are not that well received, or with a more kind of, equal balance. I mean, I always think that if you believe in something really strongly and you think it's really special, it's always slightly disconcerting for somebody to say, no, I don't like it, it's trash or whatever, or you've made a mistake. And it's a very hard thing to process, actually, when you believe in something so much, to hear negative kind of feedback to it. This record I've had, thankfully, relatively few negative reactions to the record. But the answer to your question is, I don't think I necessarily went about this record in any, apart from what we've already talked about,
Right.
the sort of, the actual process of making it. I didn't necessarily think this record, I didn't think any more strongly about this record than I did about any of the other records, which is to say I felt very strongly about all of them. So it came as a surprise to me that this record was so well received. As to why it was more well received, perhaps it is something to do with the more live feel of the record. Perhaps it is something to do with the standard of musicianship on this record is so good because these guys are so good. Perhaps just for whatever reason I hit a kind of seam of writing that's kind of really resonated with people on this album. The subject matter, the kind of concept, all to do with mortality and loss and regret and this ghost story idea. People really seem to like that. But I couldn't have planned it that way. It's not like I sat down and said, okay, what's really going to make... Because in a way, I'm always hoping that people will always, it will click. And for some reason, this record's clicked. Probably in a way that it may never happen again, so I have to enjoy it. I have to enjoy this while it's happening, yeah.
With your solo material, I just kind of found it curious. Like, obviously, you have, Stephen Wilson and then Porcupine Tree and then Blackfield. What, with your solo work... offers, like, what unique thing does it offer you creatively versus the other projects, perhaps? Like, is there like a unique thing with each project you have that you kind of aim at differently? Like, how do you go about that exactly?
Every band, and when I say band, I mean a band that is a democratic unit rather. I mean, this is a band, but they're a band that are basically working for me. But most bands are a democratic unit. So as soon as you have a democratic unit, you have this idea of compromise comes up. And that's not to say that it's necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes compromise is finding an area of music where you all agree that that's what you want to play, and that becomes a very strong identity for a band. But there are always things outside of that, not just for me, but also the other guys in the bands, that they're not able to bring into that, because somebody will say, I don't like that. We're not going to do that. I don't like that. So you have to find somewhere where you all agree this is what we want to do. That becomes, by definition, your sound, your band identity. So the answer to your question is, there's always been things in collaborations where I've compromised, and equally there have been things where the other person in the situation, or the other people in the situation, have also compromised for me. The solo work has none of that. I can do whatever I like. Now, as I say, that can be a bad thing too. Right. You can become incredibly self-indulgent and disappear up your own posterior and make something that nobody wants to listen to. I've been lucky in the sense that this record seems, as we've already discussed, seems to have resonated very strongly with people. But I would say that so the answer to your question, the main thing is that there are no compromises for the sake of other people. That, in a nutshell, that's the appeal of it for me.
I guess it kind of all has been tying in with what we've been saying already, but you've been known for being more kind of at the front of progressive rock / metal, kind of that boundary there. Obviously, your work with like remastering the King Crimson albums and everything, obviously those would be some of your stronger influences. How would you kind of describe, I guess in a short way, kind of your major influences that have kind of, guided you along your career to what's like?
I think you use the word progressive, and I'm glad you used the word progressive and not the word prog, which I can't stand the word prog. But I mean, progressive for me is, obviously that's an important touchstone, but I think more broadly, the idea of the album as a musical journey, as a musical continuum, is the basis of everything I do. So I'm not the kind of guy who's going to go out and write 10 3 or 4 minute songs, throw them together on a record. I'm the kind of guy that's going to think about how can I take the listener on a musical journey across this next 45 or 50 minutes. And that really is at the basis of everything I've ever done, whether it's been with Blackfield, No Man, Porcupine Tree, my solo work, and regardless of what genre I've been working in, whether it's been metal orientated or completely far away from that in more ambient textural music, it's always been that basic principle at the heart of it. And I think that is ultimately, that's the basic principle at the heart of what we call progressive rock. Progressive rock is not about 3-minute. Clearly, it's not about 3-minute pop songs. It's about expanding the musical palette. It's about expanding the musical structure. And that's what has always appealed to me.
What would you credit as like your first big album that kind of opened that world to you? Was there one that stands out?
Well, there was a record that I didn't hear by choice, but my father used to listen to all the time, that I think kind of seeped into my subconscious, and that was Dark Side of the Moon. And like a lot of dads in the 70s, he was listening to that record, and I mean, it's not my favorite. It's not even my favorite Floyd record, but I would say that it is in some ways the record that began to form my musical DNA, because I heard it almost by default, subconsciously. It began to shape. And I was only like 8-9 years old at the time, but it began to shape my idea of what music was. So that, and I think you can clearly see that, that you can hear that very clearly, that record, we talked about this idea of the album as a musical journey. That's, what better example could you think of? Yeah.
Are there any bands working today? Any, I guess bands working today are current bands, but any other current bands that you listen to that you feel do that kind of illustrate that idea for you as well?
Yeah, there are. I mean, not enough, in my opinion. At least not enough bands really doing it in really interesting ways. But there's the obvious kind of artists. These bands like Radiohead and Nine Inch Nails and Opeth. The kind of bands that are very much about the album as an art form. Even bands like Flaming Lips, I think they're an interesting band. They always seem to treat each project as a kind of an opportunity to do something different and evolve and push the envelope. I'd like a lot of people who, when you get to this kind of level that I'm at, I get a lot of demos, and I have to say that most of them are disappointing, not because they're bad, but because they're generic. And I think that being generic is the main problem we have in the current musical scene. That there's no question there's more music than ever before. I mean, everyone can make music at home now on a laptop with a piece of software, and a few boxes. You can make it to a very high standard. But the problem is that we have more music than ever before, but we have more generic music than ever before. And this is why I don't like sometimes words like prog, because prog sounds terribly quaint and ghettoized, do you know what I mean?
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think progressive music, to give it its full term, can encompass everything from Opeth to Radiohead to Flaming Lips to Massive Attack to Aphex Twin, and to me that kind of progressive sensibility, that wanting to take the listener on a musical journey or explore the possibilities of music, is something that's completely absent from most quote-unquote prog music. It's simply like someone has sat down and said, I'm going to try as hard as I can to sound like Genesis circa 1973, and I've been accused of that myself, and there are certainly influences that creep in that are quite retro, But I suppose from my point of view, I like things where I listen to it and I think, wow, I can't quite tell where these guys are coming from, and that's a good thing. But it doesn't happen as often as I would like.
In terms of kind of the more metal aspects of what you've done, obviously, being more of a progressive rock kind of person, you hear more about the Pink Floyd influences and the King Crimson influences. What metal influences would you kind of accredit to some of your heavier, darker sounds, perhaps?
Well, it's interesting. That's an interesting question. What would I credit as being the influence for the darker things is actually not metal music necessarily. And this is interesting because I share this with my friend Michael from Opeth, and his music is obviously quite heavy and quite dark. But the real heaviness comes not from metal music, but from other forms of music. For example, there's a Italian composer called Jacinto Scelsi, who wrote orchestral pieces that are without question the most evil and dark things I have ever heard in my life. And I've every time I meet someone that's into like heavy dark music, I get them into Scelsi, and they're all blown away with it. You know, this guy's music is far more. And I think we're in it. Are you guys from a metal magazine, right? Is that kind of
Metal website.
Okay, yeah. Right. I don't know, but I think metal. And I love metal, of course I do, and it's been a big part of my life. But I think metal now, the musical vocabulary of metal has become almost too ubiquitous. It's so familiar to us. That heavy sound, that detuned sound, the pummeling double bass drums, it's so familiar to us that actually it doesn't sound heavy anymore.
It's becoming generic.
It's becoming generic. And I remember, quite timely, because Jeff Hanneman's just passed away, hasn't he? I remember hearing Rain in Blood for the first time and being completely blown away. And so that's a record. And I know I'm not the only one. I think so many people would. For them, that record is a touchstone, isn't it? It's the beginning of something. That and Master of Puppets. They sounded. You guys are too young to remember probably, but I remember I was just about old enough to remember when those records came out, and they sounded extraordinary. Because I'd been listening to bands like Saxon and Iron Maiden a few years earlier, thinking that music couldn't possibly get any heavier, and then. Really, and hearing Wheels of Steel, I'm thinking this is as heavy as music's ever going to get. It can't. And then hearing Rain in Blood 5 years later, and you're just like, this is just amazing. And I think the problem is that actually metal hasn't really developed much beyond that in the last 25 years. I love Meshuggah. I love the sort of more polyrhythmic technical side that came into metal. I love what Michael did with metal, kind of almost from Opeth, almost like fusing it with his progressive sensibilities and his experimental sensibility. But generally I would say that a lot of metal music again just passes me by because it is too generic. No matter how much I may admire the sound of the records, it's just nothing that really appeals to me. So this is all by way of saying, in a very long way of saying, that actually a lot of the influence of the darker and more metallic aspects of my music comes from other forms of music rather than metal itself. Yeah, but of course, Rain in Blood, Master of Puppets, like everyone else, they were big records for me. Meshuggah's records were very important to me when I discovered them, like 12, 13 years ago. Destroy, Erase, Improve was a very important record to me. Opeth were very important to me. Some of the doom metal bands like Sun-O and Esoteric, if you know Esoteric, I kind of lapped up their music for a while, so that's all in there, I think. Yeah.
Kind of culling a few, from a few of our conversations earlier. So you talked a little bit about Michael Ockerfeldt from Opeth. You talked a little bit about the reaction to your projects when you released the Storm Corrosion record. Was that last year?
Yeah,
last year.
Yeah.
Did the reaction to that surprise you at all?
It seemed kind of mixed in a way.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that didn't surprise me. We knew it was going to be controversial records. The thing is that I think when me and Michael announced we were going to do a project together, everyone made an assumption about what it was going to sound like. And at that point, we immediately ran in the opposite direction because A, we're bloody minded, and two, we just didn't want to make a sort of supergroup death metal or progressive metal record. We wanted to do something much more textural and experimental. Now, people that love that record absolutely love it. The people that hate that record absolutely hate it. You know what? I think I'm pretty happy with that. Myself and Michael, I saw Michael a few days ago in Albany, and we were just talking again about how much we love that record and how proud we are. We're so proud of that record. I think it's the kind of record that people will still be listening to in 100 years' time, because it almost exists it exists outside of everything. It doesn't belong to any genre. It doesn't belong to any time, and it's just such a in a sense, it's one of the purest records I think I've ever made. The response, it didn't surprise me, no. I mean, because, as soon as you said Michael and Steve are going to do a record together, you know that people are going to expect something, and you know you're going to disappoint those people.
Yeah, and I personally, I really enjoyed that record, and I liked that it was, I liked that when the first time I spun it, I was, huh?
Yeah. Like, right. Well, I think, and that's what we wanted, and we wanted to piss people off. as sort of pleasantly surprise people. You know, we weren't trying to be bloody minded for the sake of it. We really were proud of that record, but we knew that there were, you know, the more kind of, shall we say, conservative metal community were going to absolutely rail against it and hate it, and they did.
Because it seemed like it had like, obviously like your guys' influence in there, but it was kind of in more of a progressive, kind of like dark, eerie way that you kind of hadn't really heard before. Like there was a heaviness to it, but it wasn't like audibly like we were saying before, what people associate with being heavy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I would say that the Storm Corrosion record fed directly out of what we were both doing on our own records at the time, Michael on Heritage and me on Grace for Drowning, which comes back to something we were saying about earlier, trying to find ways to create heavy, dark, oppressive music without relying on the stock sort of heavy musical vocabulary, which I think we both feel is utterly exhausted. And I would love to be proved wrong. I would love for there to be a new metal band to come along and totally blow me away with. But these days, I think that as soon as I hear those sounds, they no longer have the impact that they did. Whereas other sounds like keyboard textures, orchestral textures, you know, we used a lot of woodwind on that record. They can sound incredibly dark and oppressive in ways that are much more unfamiliar particularly to rock fans. You know.
I realize now we're talking about things that happened a year ago, which in internet time may as well have been the Stone Age. But before we wrap up the Storm Corrosion aspect, did you guys have any hands-on input or do anything with the music video for the song Drag Ropes? Was that your guys' kind of idea for that illustration and whatnot?
It was basically a rough idea that came from the lyrics, and that was it. And we hired this brilliant director called Jessica Cope, and she created that. Basically I had the idea that I wanted this shadow puppets idea, and we had this idea that it was a song about kind of witch hunting, you know, in the Dark Ages, as it were. Beyond that, we didn't really have anything strong, and she created that whole world and created the puppets and the film. And she's now gone on to make a video for me for the title track of The Raven as well, which again is just unbelievably good. She's just a brilliant talent. It's great when you meet people that you feel you can entrust, you know, like you just give them the vaguest of sketches and you know they'll come back with something extraordinary, and she's one of those people.
Well, I suppose we could definitely keep talking forever, but just to start wrapping things up here a little bit, what is on the horizon for you next? Is it more Steven Wilson stuff or Porcupine Tree, or is there anything you know for sure that you're going to aim for?
I don't have any real solid plans right now. The thing is that we're touring pretty much to the end of the year with this record now. We have a little break over the summer. We have some festivals, but then we're back out in September, and that goes through to the beginning of December. Because as we kind of already talked about, the record has been unexpectedly well received, so there's more opportunity coming off the back of that to tour and promote it. So I want to, you know, make the most of that really. So we're going to tour a lot more this year. Beyond that, you know, I mean, I have a lot more of this remix work that you talked about coming in, classic albums from the 70s, and I love doing that, so I'm very happy to keep doing that. As regards what my next creative project will be, I know what I would like it to be. I would love to do a movie soundtrack. You know, for me, that's top of my list of unfulfilled kind of creative ambitions, but, you know, it's easy to say, it's hard to get into that world, but I would love to work with a great director on a great script, you know, for my next project.
And obviously, I might be splitting hairs here, but when you say a soundtrack, do you mean something similar to like what Trent Reznor did with Social Network and Girl with the Dragon Tattoo?
Exactly that. I mean, you know, I would love to have that kind of relationship. I mean, like David Finch is now using Trent, it seems, and Atticus Ross pretty much for everything he does. That's terrific. You know, the way that Danny Elfman was always working with Tim Burton, and John Williams is always working with Steven Spielberg, Hans Zimmer is always working with Christopher Nolan. I would love to have that kind of connection and relationship with a great creative director, you know, and maybe there's someone out there that's just about to make their first movie and they're looking for a good, you know, someone that kind of understands the sound aspects. there's a lot of luck involved, as always, in these things, timing. But that's really the one thing I've always felt was missing from my CV, which was because people talk about my music as being cinematic and very visual, and I suppose it is. But I've never had the opportunity to actually work with image, film, cinema, and I would love to.
So I guess just the follow up to that, if every director who has a composer they go to right now, or just everybody's a free agent, is there a director working whose images you would just love to compose music for?
Well, all the ones I've just mentioned, all the ones I've just mentioned who've already. I love Christopher Nolan's. I thought Inception was just a modern masterpiece, and everyone always would want to work with David Lynch, and he's another one. But I guess what I'm really looking for is somebody that maybe I've not even heard his name yet, but maybe he's some guy that's just got money from Hollywood to develop his first movie, and he's looking for. And somebody I've yet to meet, but of course, if the opportunity came up to do,
won't turn it down.
I'm not going to turn down Christopher Nolan or David Fincher if for any reason they fall out, have a massive row with Trent or Hans Zimmer. I'm there, dude. But no, I think realistically, I'm looking for somebody that maybe hasn't got that kind of history yet, because once these guys get their kind of regular guys, they do tend to rely on them. Yeah.
Well, we always like to leave interviews off on kind of more fun questions, and I know you had brought up the unfortunate passing of Jeff Hanneman the other day. So, besides Raining Blood, does Steven Wilson have a particular favorite Slayer song and/or riff other than Raining Blood?
Slayer song. Oh, I'm very boring. I'm gonna pick the one that probably so many people will pick, Angel of Death. It's the first track off the first Slayer album I ever heard, and it's still definitive, really, for me. Yeah.
I'd say that's a good one to end off on. So, everyone, this has been another Brutalitopia interview here with Steven Wilson. Steven, thank you so much, and good luck.
Very good. No, it's good. It was fun.